Welcome to Algy's Investment Podcast, and my guest today is Ken Costa, who's been a leading global investment banker, author, philanthropist, and thought leader for the last 40 years. Brought up in South Africa, he was an active anti-apartheid student in Johannesburg. He then came over to the UK and he studied law and theology at Queen's College, Cambridge. Whilst he was an investment banker, one of the major deals he did was actually to sell Harrods to the Qataris. But more recently, and the reason why I've invited him here to talk to me today is because he is the author of a wonderful book called The $100 Trillion Wealth Transfer. It's how the handover from the boomers to Gen Z will revolutionize capitalism. And if you haven't read it, it is available on Amazon. Ken, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Algy.
Well, it's taken a little bit of planning and coordination to get us at the same place on the right day. But
we're here, and it's great to be with you. Thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. Ken, I've read your incredible book. And for those of you that haven't read your book, I'm going to do a bit of blatant marketing for you.
Oh, I love that.
and show the camera the book. The book's called The $100 Trillion Wealth Transfer, and it's all about the handover of wealth from the baby boomers to the millennials and Gen Z. And it's a really fascinating, insightful read. And I read the book and thought I definitely needed to probe a little further and ask some questions that were sort of bubbling up in my mind, having given it a good, thorough reading. So here we are today. And my first question, very simple one. Can you explain briefly what your book is actually about and what inspired you, most importantly, to write it?
Well, those are two great questions. And can I unashamedly, on the Algy podcast, say the Korean edition for those who've got Ken Pops or K-Pops or their friends in Korea has just come out. So I'm very pleased to be here and to sport the Korean edition. But good question, Algy. I mean, so the reason I wrote the book was that I've spent a lot of time advising families, but also looking at the next generation of those families and recognizing that there really is a big change that is occurring. So because of working with startups and mentoring, coaching, helping, investing in that next generation, I took a particular interest in it and started working out, well, what is going to happen when this wealth transfer takes place. So that's why I was doing it. It piqued my interest, and I had a lot of direct investment and knowledge of the young people that were starting that, as well as my boomer friends. So boomer and zoomer, sort of coming together.
And what do you think, having written the book, is the starkest contrasts that divide the boomers from the millennials and Gen Z as people?
Well, could I just come back to your original question, part 2, which is just simply to say what the book's about, because that will help answer the very important question. So what the book is about is basically to say that there is, the normal thing is someone will say to you, well, we're going to die. And when we die, somebody else is going to inherit. That's always happened. So Ken, what you're saying. But what I was saying is that there are 3 things that make a complete difference. And that is this wealth transfer, we have never seen the size of it because of, sort of low interest rates, asset explosion for a generation. And people will say, oh, well, yes, you've got the wealth, and in due course it'll all transfer. Well, actually, the statistics are pretty clear. The value is being transferred right now. So it's not Bank of America or Barclays Bank that is the greatest provider of equity capital to the next generation. It is BOMAD. The BOMAD is the provider, the bank of mum and dad. And the bank of mum and dad have been the ones that have provided the base capital for a deposit on a house, helping subsidize the rent, paying some of the college fees in the US. So that was the first piece. And then there are two other bits that go with it. So wealth transfers, you may say in large quantities, but no different. But then what transfers is power. Because of the technology that has come with it. This is a generation so equipped, they're digital natives, so equipped with the power to change. And on top of that, it transfers with influence in social media, the ability to reach places rapidly. They could fill a stadium in 2 days' notice. They could change the shareholders meeting of a major corporation by one social media comment. So those three things make a big difference to why this time it is different.
So it really is empowering the next generation.
Well, yes, but they don't like the idea that you might say, or I might say, that we're empowering them. They've got their hands on the lever of power, and they are saying, do you know what? We've got our hands on it, and what is more, we know what we want to do with it. So there is an agenda that works both to the power, to the wealth, to the influence, which is we want to see, the environment, justice, growing, sustainability as part of the way of our lives. We want to see the planet protected.
So, having just set the scene, what are the starkest divisions between boomers and millennials?
Well, of course, there's the caricature. And the caricature is, this is a whole bunch of feckless, smashed avocado eaters whose only crisis occurs when the battery of their mobile device runs out. It's a caricature. And back comes the mud. This is an analog, emotionally constipated generation that doesn't really understand. And this is the point, they've lived off the fat of the land, such that their assets have grown. And I'm 38, which is the average age, and I still can't get a decent house of my own.
Yes.
So that it is stark. And of course, you can carry on into the realities of it. An older generation says, well, we worked hard. And the new one says, the older one, boomer, thinks that, the Zoomers feel entitled. But these are caricatures. It's not what I believe. I'm just saying that is where you'd find the chasm. And
just taking that one step further, do you think that the Zoomers, as you describe them, believe that we have had a better crack at life than they are going to be able to have?
Oh, 100%. Because they can see the accumulation of the assets, which they wouldn't mind if they could also share in it. But whereas they would say, you have managed to take that, we're seeing, the inequality, generational inequality is everywhere. Living standards are going to drop, populations are aging, the pensioners are growing because of good health, and who's going to be supporting them but that generation coming up? And until we address generational inequality, we are building in social tension.
I think you're absolutely right. Because one of the things that it's worth just dwelling on for a second is what it does to the state pension. And if you have an increasing aging population and a decreasing working population, that means when it's their turn, they're going to have to retire later in life.
Yes, if not, government intervening to make even now with people retiring later, because medicine has made it so much more comfortable that health issues are stark, but they're not as bad as they were. So it definitely has to be addressed one way or the other.
Yeah.
Either way, it creates tension.
And talking about tension, just going back to 2007, 2008,
Yeah.
and maybe the canary in the coal mine was household finance going bust, which had been bought by HSBC. And then we had the global financial crisis. Do you think that our generation was totally to blame for the financial crisis, or were we asleep at the wheel, or had capitalism just slipped into a state of immoral moorings?
Well, I think it is the third. I don't think it was, not as a generation asleep at the wheel at the time, or just weren't paying attention to it. What I do think is that capitalism slipped its moral moorings. And indeed, at the time, I wrote an article precisely on that topic, how capitalism has slipped its moorings, and became the professor of commerce at Gresham College, delivered a series of lectures precisely on this point. So what happened was, and this is why it's significant, the current generation, the Zoomers, have all grown up with their parents seeing that which was the rock-solid part of the economy, which were banks, even still remembering, where they were. They haven't changed that much by then. Tumbling. Governments having to intervene to save the banks. And they were saving the banks, but not any of the major industrial businesses that were collapsing at the time. And they saw the effect that had on their parents. And that had brought an extraordinary sense of insecurity to the generation. And they didn't trust the banks in the way in which their parents had trusted. And the level of distrust generally for anything corporate, institutional, started growing. And that continues to this day in the Zoomer generation.
I think that's so well put. And so what lessons from the embarrassment of what happened of the financial crisis can we pass on to ensure that the right sort of capitalism flourishes in the future, that is sustainable and is collaborative and is good for the world?
Well, the way I define it is that we need to recover socially energized capital. Social because it's involved in the society around us. And people want to live well in the communities in which they're living, particularly the generation that we're talking about. Zoomers, above all else, want to belong to a community. So it is social. But the great thing is it's creative. Socially, creative energy is what we actually believe this next generation has in spades. They are very creative. The creativity is growing. The startups, the new ventures that are being taken is helping to shape the way in which quite a sclerotic capitalism has grown up. But as always, capitalism fights back and is undermined by the next generation. But it is capitalism. And the risk that we have is that with a generation will see that, well, we want to do well and we want to do good, which is great, but you've got to be able to do well, to create value, to be taking risk, to see the rewards for risk. And that's what our generation will also have to hand over to a generation that probably never seen a recession, doesn't know what inflation actually is and does, and to help out in this socially energized capitalism that I think is what will hold the next generation of young capitalists together.
And one of the things that came out in the book as well was I thought this was fascinating. I was always brought up, you get up in the morning, you work from 8 till 6 or whatever it might be, and when the job's finished, you end your week. And what you are saying in the book is that the Zoomers have a completely different way of thinking about work.
totally different way of thinking about work. And the mindset is, it is simply not true that if you work harder, you will do better. That was true of the boomer generation. But in the next generation, it is much more the smarter move. You have to work smart. And they are able to work smart. Why? Because they've got an amazing array of technology and are not afraid of it. So whether it's ChatGPT or quantum computing, which is coming upon us quite rapidly and will again make these massive changes, they're more adaptable to change, less frightened by the future, and able to use that technology in a smart way. So it's the smart ones that, and that's a good thing.
That's a really good thing.
Yes, because what I think is so important is for the boomers generation, which has made the capital, to regard it as part of their social duty, and I certainly do that, to invest in the startups of the next generation, so that you mix together the smart thinking of the generation and the capital of a previous one.
And do you think that the Zoomers are much more comfortable having more than one job? Not just in their life, but at a time.
Well, they don't like side hustles as much. Except, Algy, for you with your investment podcast.
I know, it's terrible. It's terrible, isn't it?
It's a great side hustle to have. It's transforming. And I think this is what's happening everywhere, because people are living longer, have got more time to devote to other things. And one of the things that I think is important is actually, the way I describe it is this: we need the hindsight of our generation. I didn't want to include you.
I'm very happy.
The hindsight of our generation, the insight of what I call the Zennials, Gen Z and Millennials, the Zennial generation, that insight, to create the foresight for the growth of socially energized capitalism. That's what I think we can do, and that requires a mutual understanding. You see, to different audiences, the way I put it is this: wealth will transfer, and is being transferred now. It's not going to happen in 10 years' time.
And some's already happened.
It's happened. But what happens to wisdom?
Oh.
Does that transfer? There's the cliffhanger.
It's far too early to have cliffhangers. I've got a lot more questions to ask. Did you understand in 2009 what the effects of printing money by central banks was going to be on equity markets? Because I didn't. It took me about 3 or 4 months to work it out.
It was very difficult at the time, and largely because, it was existential. It wasn't a question of, the entire system was on a knife edge when that Friday afternoon call was made to the Chancellor by the Royal Bank of Scotland at the time, to say, I don't know that we can hold the dam. At that moment, anything could have gone wrong. So for a long period after that, the consequences of what this would mean was being weighed up. We'd never seen anything. It was sui generis. It was, but the interesting thing was that the sharper economists were telling us that the inflationary consequences were significant, and therefore one had to act in that way rather than to retract, which happened in the Depression of the 30s. But whether we could have foreseen what would have happened, I doubt, because the legacy 10, 15 years later is still there, because the borrowings haven't been reduced. Inflation has made some sort of real indent, but by and large.
And the borrowings are all too short term. They should have borrowed for longer.
Absolutely.
Where were you when Lehman's went bust? Can you remember?
I was. I was I was at the time chairman international of Lazard, and I remember pulling together the FIG team, the financial institutions team, saying, look, we ought to do something. And we went off to the Treasury, because I had worked previously with a bank in Sweden, and to say to the Treasury, you must at this moment create a good bank and a bad bank. And the Treasury Minister was very good and said, yes, I understand in the usual way, I understand. But they didn't do that. Had they done that, I think we would have come out of it much more rapidly, as the American banks did. And the good bank would have been able to, in every way, be able to be sold for significantly more than is being eked out now from the final dribbling out of the NatWest shares owned by the government.
Despite the temptation of getting tempted to talk about history,
yes,
I'm going to get us back on track.
Yep.
And Gen Z, Zoomers, whatever you want to call them, that the younger generations don't trust fiat money. I don't believe. Money has changed its form over many thousands of years. What form do you think money will take in the future?
Well, that's such a good question. I'm no economist on this, or I think you need more than that. But we have to ask ourselves the question. We assume that central banks were always the custodians of money. But it was only the Riksbank in Sweden that started the central banks, 2 or so centuries ago. There's always been bankers. Who says that it should only be a central bank that should be the cornerstone or the Fed in any particular country? Where does that come from? And so there is a rethink that's going on, and the cryptocurrencies are here to stay. This is not something that's a fly-by-night, here today, gone tomorrow. In part, it's a protest movement.
It's a very big protest movement.
Protest movement because the demographic ownership of crypto is heavily skewed to a generation that is itself, partly sort of really angry with the way in which fiat currencies are manipulated. And yes, the behavior, the volatility of a Bitcoin or whatever, stable coin or whatever you'd want to have doesn't suggest it's a currency. But these are early days.
And do you think that the volatility of the biggest one is Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Do you think that the volatility of Bitcoin will reduce in the next 20, 30, 40 years as the digital world evolves?
Yes, because as you know, there's a finite number of Bitcoins that can be mined. It doesn't mean to say they can't be split into the tiniest of denominations. I think it will over a period of time, but not before it would have shot up into very much higher levels than I suspect we're seeing at the moment.
And do you think, when you talk to the young, and this is a terrible generalization, do you think that there are? I mean, they are much more collaborative. They're much more concerned about the planet and the well-being in society.
Yes.
Are there any trends, be it social or political, that you can see coming through clearly from those generations, or is that not at all obvious to you?
I tell you what there is in finance, which is causing real issues to the regulators, and it's this: is finance has become gamified, and so a generation that's been used to playing, every kind of gaming there is, and with, you could have your club of friends playing with friends in Korea. So you're right about the community piece, but when you see some of the apps that are being used and actively used, it changes the whole nature of what investment really is. So, for example, you can buy a fraction of, say, Amazon share, if you want any other share.
Yes.
Don't want to be promoting shares. And you get it on your app. You buy it for $20. If it goes to $22, the lights go on, a bubble, it's a tree, something hits up and says, "You have made. Would you like to buy more?" And so we're getting into this. It's not a casino, because by and large they are quite shrewd because they're talking to each other.
But it's gamifying.
It's gamifying, and gamifying is something one does have to be very careful about, particularly for investment professionals who talk about steady growth over the period, et cetera. Now, this is going to change quite significantly. I mean, there is no fund manager on the planet that should stand away from understanding what is happening in that generation.
We've touched on it already, in a sense, but how will technology affect the massive transfer of wealth to the next generation?
Well, I mean, firstly, it's going to be the information flow, the way in which information will flow. I mean, it's pretty scary when you get people on TikTok telling you to buy shares. I mean, well, where's the regulator for the TikTok that is in the cloud? I mean, don't know where they are. And people are buying shares off the back of that. In the better view of it would be that technology is going to enable, in the digitalization, I'll give you an example from real estate. The digitalization will grow to such an extent that you'll be able to buy within a building rather than to buy the asset of the building. Generation will be able to say, "Oh, I really like to have that floor because it's owned by Google and that's a better tenant and it'll be and I understand there's a better return. I want to buy a portion of that." That's unthinkable 10 years ago.
Yes.
No, so the way in which we will see the sort of cutting and dicing of almost every single asset will be significant. The second is the trade finance, or the global movement of trade is in the analog age. I mean, some of them are still bits of paper, trying to govern,
yeah.
And that will change. Not only will it change in it be digitalized, but actually the financing of it becomes so much easier because it becomes clearer as to who the owners are, where they and the supply chains become freed up as a result of the technological change. And the greatest asset class, in my view, still unexploited for that reason, the flowing of trade between various nations will itself take a significant move forward in the next decade because of the technology.
And that actually moves very sweetly on to my next question, which is, in geographical terms, where has the center of gravity moved from in terms of the world of finance?
Well, there's a question. If you mean by that in the tax, the favorable tax havens in every generation, I mean, we can remember it. I mean, when everybody went to Hong Kong, then it moved to Singapore. Now it's Dubai, where a generation is looking for low tax, good return while they're young enough to build some capital,
yes,
and then maybe come home and buy the rectory in Hampshire. But I think the interesting thing is that it's going to be the place where confidence is strong. Now, one of the real issues that we're facing at the moment in the US is the undermining of predictable confidence in the financial management of the reserve currency of the world.
Absolutely.
And that, I think, is as scary as it comes. So we've got to bear in mind that there will be people looking for safety and security at the same time as undermining it. Now, what do I mean by that? Which is that the entire sort of way in which crypto will operate will be totally distributive. There'll be a bunch of people working together in Romania, in Cape Town, all over the world.
All over the world.
Because you only need the cloud. If you ask me, where's the center of finance, like New York or London or Tokyo was for our generation, it'd be the cloud, wherever that is.
Greenland.
Yeah.
And to what extent do you think migration of the world's populations could affect the future generations, particularly in Europe? Because look at Nigeria. I mean, it's the fifth largest population in the world, massive population boom, and as a betting man, there's a very strong chance there's going to be a huge migration up through North Africa into Europe over the next 100 years.
Interesting. As you may know, I chair the largest private equity group in Africa. And one of the things we're seeing, which I think is so encouraging, is as a result of technology and also the youthening. I mean, if you look at the youth curves, I mean, statistics.
I like that word.
The youthening of those nations has meant that many more people have become active in the economies of their countries and globally, such that you can begin to see jobs being created in the sort of technological way. Now, they need a basic digital infrastructure to make it work, but that is already being done. And I think, yes, it is a danger. And yes, somehow or another, the mere stopping of people crossing the Mediterranean is going to become easier. It has to be tackled at source, and technology is going to be able to help, provided there is good investment. I mean, the withdrawal of the United States from these hubs where we could see people employed and technology and creating employment, starving of capital is really a misunderstanding.
Totally. Actually, I can see exactly where you're coming from. And I think I can see also where you're coming from in terms of the frailties of the world's reserve currency. What do you think the future of the US dollar is?
It's above my pay grade. I mean, the problem about it is the political manipulation of it.
Right.
And one day, the buyers of treasuries will simply say, we want another 50 basis points for the risk that you're taking. And the risk is of uncertainty.
Yes.
And that is what I'm more worried about. Is how do you pricing it is going to be so difficult.
That's the difficulty, isn't it? The pricing.
Yeah.
The further east I look, particularly I look to China and India, but the further east I look, the further out the net zero targets are for those economies. And we've had our industrial revolution, so many will say that is only fair, that they need to be able to have theirs, but there are still coal-fired power stations being built on a very rapid basis in China, but the race to get to net zero in Europe does possibly create problems because it's meant that the cost of energy has gone up so much, and the industrial base is finding it very difficult to be competitive. Do you think, with your wealth of experience in the in the financial world, buying and selling businesses, that this is going to be to the detriment of the prosperity of Europe?
Well, it looks that way unless there is a realignment within the political consensus in Europe, which is breaking down. Basically what people said, this is the mistake. It's the politician said, here is a lever, it's brown. You pull the lever and it's green. And that became net zero. And so it became, in the UK, a requirement, a matter of law that that we had to get to net zero in the period of time. At the same time, of course, we're seeing, just as you described, others that are paying no attention to it. And so it becomes more and more difficult to justify increased standard of living when the benefit of it is not being able to be recognized globally. So you can't say I'm taxing you now because it's more expensive and your energy is going up, so that you might be more secure in Hampshire. I don't know, nothing against Hampshire, Herefordshire. Here in the UK, when in full knowledge, it's a global issue, has to be addressed at a global level. And we mustn't forget that this is a generation that wants to see the planet protected. Whatever the last elections might have shown, that is still unchallenged.
Yep, very clear. One topic I didn't quite understand, it may be just because I'm a bear with few brain cells, but what did you mean by the feminization of finance? Because I sort of got the impression that maybe some of the research you'd looked into was alluding to the fact that women might have different financial objectives to men.
Well, what I was doing in that, I detected certain major changes. The transfer of wealth, the move from west to east, brown to green, male to female was unexpressed. It simply meant that the assets being controlled, the businesses being controlled by women, would be significantly, by the end of the decade, be 10 billion greater than we've ever
had before.
And that, I think, is just a function of a change in the society around us. I don't think it's any particularly different skill set, or if it is, I'm not aware of it.
But actually, it's very healthy.
It's very healthy, yes.
And then if you could add a little bit of colour to your observations between the differences between town hall discussions and digital forum groups, because I did sense that there are pros and cons of both.
Well, there are, which is why we have this very interesting debate at the moment, where major institutions are wanting to prevent major companies from having only online shareholders meetings. Now, at one level, it's much more efficient. You don't fly everybody around the world. I mean, you've been to Omaha. You wouldn't trade that for a digital gathering. So you've got this tension of being able to say, is it better for groups of people to be together, whether it is for a presentation, whether it is for a shareholders meeting? And I think we're going to settle somewhere in between. I don't think one or the other is going to prevail, because there's something to be said for both. That you know that it is online and digital, but the presence of a group of shareholders holding the board to account with line of sight and questions is very important part of ensuring that good governance is maintained in our corporate system.
Absolutely. And is it possible that digital forum groups can be more tribal and potentially more extremist?
Yes, because basically they'll you will find factions being pulled together to create a particular purpose. So, for example, a lobbying group will find it easier to gather a digital community and express their view to in a shareholders meeting or in a community meeting, because the sheer numbers that you can command are stronger. But the involvement and the engagement isn't. And engagement is what matters, not mere clickbait or clicks on the numbers roll.
Collaborative engagement sounds just wonderfully cuddly and sort of good for the planet, and possibly for business too. But what about corporate profits? All this collaboration, it might be good for the employees, but is corporate profitability going to suffer as a result of this change in attitude that's evolving?
Not at all. You cannot have profit, in my view, without purpose. And purpose matters to the generation more than anything else. And so, therefore, if the profits are earned in a purposeful way, clear direction, knowing where the corporation wants to be, investing well, good employee relationships, but still making sure that there are rewards for taking risk, proper evaluation, proper grading, which is all being frowned on, then I think we are going to be in a better place. And it sounds cuddly, and in a previous generation it was. I mean, just look at what annual reports look like now. I mean, do you ever wade through those first bits of guff? No. But everybody has to write them. Now, of course, a generation is coming up saying, I actually want to know, and you can ask any employer, when they're dealing with the Gen Zs and the Zennials, they want to know, what is the objective of this company? Where are you going? How can I be helping you go achieve it?
Yeah.
And I'll tell you the interesting thing about it is you and I would have grown up on feedback. We'd sort of sit there, someone would say, well, he's not up to scratch, he should be doing this. It's a generation that doesn't like feedback at all. They want feed forward. They want to know where the company is going and what the objectives would be and how they can participate in shaping that future.
That's so positive, isn't it?
Very positive. I mean, you were mildly cynical, if I may say so, Algy, on being cuddly. But I
asked the question to poke the bear.
You did, and the bear is well poked. But talking about cuddly, I do want to come on to one thing that I think is the answer to this whole generational move. And that's in 2 letters, co. Now, you and I know about co-living, co-investing, co-working, but what we haven't cracked is co-destiny. And that, I think, is the critical piece of how the 2 generations actually work together, from an older generation coaching, mentoring, helping, tutoring, investing, from a younger generation respecting the wisdom of age, not accepting it fully, but also being prepared to learn. In other words, teachability, not the strongest suit in the armory of the next generation, becomes an important part of how we would work together. Because unless there is a cooperation of the generations, there will be the conflict of the generations. And that, I think, we need to be very careful about.
I think that's beautifully put. And I think actually it's the bringing together of the wisdoms of both generations.
Yes.
Because the young have got incredible wisdom.
Yes, absolutely. No, I like that. And that is true. It flows both ways.
Yes.
Previously, we thought it was like a good bottle of 2000 or 61 Lafite, the better it gets. It doesn't. It's not wine. Wisdom flows both ways.
Yeah. That's very well put. The working from home culture is a bit of an anathema to me. I only really started doing it during COVID. But does this really work best for the young, particularly those that are living in flats and sitting on their laptop in the bedroom, where maybe they could be better off in having an office workspace where there's a strong dynamic that's ingrained of an office culture that is vibrant and easy to learn from.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get this balance between freedom and actually the best culture to build yourself as a person?
Well, the way I put it is a very good question, as all of them have been. I talk about people living at work because working from home is a sort of suggests that you're working at home. Actually, the question we have to say to ourselves is: I'm working, whether I'm at home or at my desk, and how do I do life in this world? And living becomes more important than the geographic location. The idea that I don't have to deal with the tiresome fellow sitting next to me because I'm at home doesn't exist. It becomes more difficult because I've got to talk to them in a Zoom or whatever. Equally, the idea that everybody has to come into the office, which you've seen the swing back. Even Citibank has decided that allowing everybody to go and work in Malaga isn't quite what they had, the unintended consequences.
They had about 3,000 people that wanted to go and live there.
And why wouldn't you? There is no model that's going to force one thing or the other. So there's always going to have to be a balance between the freedom for me to choose and the requirement of a corporation to build people together into a team where they need social skills.
This is it.
Because where do you get it? And unless you're meeting with people and working together, the corporation as a whole will suffer at the team level. If you suffer at the team level, you suffer as a community.
Well, because this is slightly where my next question comes down to, because you're so right when you say we live in a globally connected world, yet we have more loneliness, we have rising depression, we are dealing with declining self-esteem quite often in the young, and we've got a slippage in the art of personal communication. Surely, in this wonderfully interconnected world, we've got problems brewing up for the future, because our generation don't know how to help Gen Z get through this completely different way of working, because it's so alien to us.
Well, it's a deep question. Who precisely is to be blamed for the epidemic of mental issues in a generation is a matter for sociological dispute. But the fact that we have the smart devices which have determined everything about you, the whole of your character is determined in an iPhone or Samsung or whatever you've got in your hand. We have to be able to add back into it the belief that everybody does have a way of looking at life and sharing that aspect, irrespective of age, and be prepared to be mutually teachable. The real problem is that our generation would say, well, we've been through it and we really do understand. You're inexperienced and you don't understand how the world works. Well, the problem is that the world changed so dramatically that it doesn't matter what your experience was.
It's irrelevant.
For the last 40 years. So I think we need to have two things. We need to have this mutuality, the co-destiny, working it out, by which the teachability on both sides actually feels we're not frightened of speaking. The problem is that a generation is frightened of speaking to another generation for fear of using the wrong language or being offensive or being cancelled or whatever it is. We have to get over that, because the human consequences of the isolation and the loneliness are far more serious than anything we have quantified to date.
I'm going to ask you a question which I've only just thought of, so apologies here. But it's a very important one,
Sure.
Which is how could the church adapt to this new world we're living in? Because faith is one of the areas of my life that I've noticed has withered on the vine as a result of our lives being different to what they were 20, 30 years ago?
Well, thank you for the question, because it's one that I've thought about a great deal, written about. It's a very, very exciting time. There is a general awakening throughout the world of the generation Gen Z that we're talking about. Bible sales in this country are up 86%. Similarly, in the US, up by 34%. The numbers of people going to churches and asking for direction in spirituality, as is defined, is just off the chart. Because the realization in a generation is that material prosperity of its own, which is what the post-war generation grew up on, will not bring happiness. And there needs to be a combination that exists both of the mind, the soul, the heart, the financial acumen, the relational communities in which we're operating. And these come together in a spirituality that, of course, the church, the official church in this country, is completely neglected. But it's changing. And it's changing because a generation is seeking and is not afraid of being able to say, this is a spiritual journey. Whereas a previous generation were ultra-rationalists, anything that matters was scientific certainty. And they realize that actually there is something that is beyond that. So I think all of this links together.
It does, doesn't it?
And the great thing, I think, is that next generation can help an older generation discover how to live happily in the end of their lives, or the 70s and 80s, with a purpose that generation is now discovering. So it's very exciting.
What a wonderful answer. Now, one word we haven't used yet today, and it's one of the most important words in our working lives, which is that of trust. Because trust is the basis of all business in the city. And the strength of relationships has enabled all sorts of deals to be done because of the trust that was underlying that relationship. Can Gen Z find trust outside of the digital world, which they do trust in, so that they too can use that bond to enable things that they didn't think possible to happen, whether it be peace or whether it be corporate deals, to their advantage?
I mean, it's a very interesting question, because the great financial crisis destroyed trust in a major institution, the banks.
Yes.
And trust has been whittled away, a total trust decay over every major institution you can think of, whether it is in the major networks, whether it is in the police, wherever it is. And trust is built back step by step, or as I say in the financial world, you build back trust deal by deal. There is no sort of global way that you can restore trust. And I think, tellingly, one of the most extraordinary things that hit me, and I mentioned in the book, was when the Occupy movement decided that it was going to take over the stock exchange. The only problem was that what they thought was the stock exchange happened to be outside St. Paul's Cathedral. So they set up this encampment outside St. Paul's Cathedral, and it was very serious. It looked as if there would be serious violence there. And the Bishop of London intervened and asked me to come and mediate with that group of people and the city fathers. I mean, St. Paul's Cathedral was closed for fear of what might happen. Crazy, but there we are. But when I was doing this sort of interviewing and understanding what people were saying and trying to reflect it back and arranging sort of with, the mayor and the Lord Mayor and the head of the FCA and other institutions to meet some of these people, the central question that they were raising was, we do not trust you. And of course, everybody grappled with how do you answer that? And then it became clearer because we don't trust the capitalist system, we don't trust the political world. But the issue of trust in a generation has to be restored in the institutions, which need to be much more open to a generational input. Can't simply be made by people who of our age to govern a generation, that is digitally literate and wants to see institutions change in a way that is understanding of the modern world.
Well, Ken, I've got to say that today's conversation has been so enlightening to me. And having read your book and then met you in the flesh and asked these questions, it is so apparent to me how important it is going to be for the younger generations to help us and for us to help the younger generation to actually deliver on what they want the future to be. And I'm extremely grateful for you coming and joining me today.
Not at all. No. It's the other way around. I'm grateful to you for inviting me onto the podcast, because at the end of the day, we have to have a co-destiny between the generations. We cannot have a conflict of the generations. We need the cooperation of the generations for the future of all of humankind.
That is the perfect final word. Thank you very much.
Thank you.